Isabel, me too. There's no one there. Is it recording? Okay. 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 But it's for later.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Coletta. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, and
I'm
I can
putting
see
my
you.
camera. Wait, because it's very dark for some reason. Okay, better now.
Oh, now it's good. And do you see my screen with the slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Excellent. So I stay camera off and muted since we are. Livia, will you be sharing my slides? Or
Yes,
shall
I would share all the slides if you can just tell me next when to move.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah, this. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
You can put the camera off now if you want, and then you can
Yes.
keep it on even for the whole session or just when you're speaking, and then you turn it off as you prefer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Livian.
Hi, Enrique.
Hello.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you well.
Perfect. We can hear you and see you well.
Yes.
Can you see my slides on the screen?
Yes, I can see your
Perfect.
slides.
So I will move your slides. If you can just tell me next, I will go on.
Okay. So you will be the one moving them, yeah?
Yeah, it's fine. You can just tell me next.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, Songul.
Hello, good morning. I was wondering if people could hear me.
Yes, I can hear you and see you.
Yeah.
So
Hello,
we'll be
yes.
waiting for the plenary session to kick the workshops off, and then we'll start officially at 9:15.
Yeah, we are also still missing one of the panelists, so hopefully she will join soon.
So the plenary
Sorry?
has been earlier.
The plenary is at 9 o'clock. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So it's just a kickoff on how we are organizing today's workshop.
Okay.
I'll also say a little bit about how this is organized later, but basically it's one plenary that is kicking off multiple parallel workshops going on at the same time. And then we'll recollect later today in a plenary session.
Perfect. How's it going so far?
Good, good. Yesterday was a good start. We had some interesting keynotes, but I really liked. So I was a rapporteur in one of the parallel sessions on data creation, and the speakers were really, they were great. They were basically speaking to my heart on all the issues that you have with just data structuring, data cleaning, when you work with data, and all these steps are quite invisible, right? And definitely not standardized at all for any data related work. So there's lots to be done, and
Very good.
I'm glad that we actually started doing that. We should have maybe even started earlier, but now that we're talking also about artificial intelligence, I think this is gaining also some momentum.
Great.
Can you hear me okay?
Good morning, Dee. Yes, we can hear you and see you well.
Good. I seem to have the sun on my face at a really awkward angle. So I'm going to try and just orientate myself so it's a bit less irritating.
I unfortunately had to close my windows because of some constructions going on outside, and it's already really hot in Sevilla. So I had to switch on my air conditioning. I hope it's not too loud.
I can't hear it at all. Right, so I've rotated myself, but now you just get a view of my tea and coffee in the background.
So also for you, there's a plenary session that is kicking off these parallel sessions that we are doing.
Yes.
And officially we'll start at 9:15.
Yes. And can I just check with the slides for each of us? Do we share them or will you be sharing them?
No, we'll be sharing them.
Great.
You can give cues with next slide, next slide.
Brilliant.
Good morning, Matteo. Can you hear us?
Good morning. Yes. Hello. Nice
Hello.
to see
Hello.
That music was coming from here, yeah? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I was trying to see whether there was some window creating music or something.
No, it's here. Yes.
Okay, okay.
Good morning, everyone. So the plenary session of the PSIS workshop has just finished, and Alexandra Balaur has kicked off the parallel sessions, the vertical sessions on different sectors where we want to discuss data quality needs and practices in different sectors. I would like to wait maybe 1 more minute just to make sure that everyone who was in the plenary finds his or her way to this plenary session. To this parallel session. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I see that some participants from the plenary sessions have joined our session, and I think we can start now. Good morning again. Welcome to this panel discussion on data quality needs and practices for artificial intelligence in education and employment. My name is Songül Tolan. I am a scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and I'll be moderating this session with support from Matteo Sostero, who is also a scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. Matteo, would you like to say hello?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Nice. Thank you all for being here, and nice to meet you.
Thanks. So this panel comes on the second day of the Putting Science into Standards workshop, the PSIS workshop. Yesterday, we had a series of keynote presentations that provided an excellent overview of the current landscape on AI ethics, data for AI quality principles, ongoing regulations, and standardization roadmaps. Today, we are starting with 6, so 3 + 3 parallel sessions that aim at deep diving into the needs of different sectors that are considered as high risk under the current proposal of the European Commission on regulating artificial intelligence, in short, the AI Act. More particularly in this panel, we will put the focus on both education and employment. And I know that some of the data-related needs and dynamics of these sectors are quite different. Obviously, no one here is implying that, for example, the relationship between teachers and students is the same as between employers and employees. But If we can talk about education, employment-specific issues with potential uses of artificial intelligence, or the collection of data for AI, and by discussing these specificities, we find some common grounds, some common data AI-related issues that would already be like a good start. Because remember, this workshop is not about defining standards perfectly and well written, but it's more for taking the first steps into the direction of standards. We will have 3 outstanding panelists in our session coming from different backgrounds. Dee Masters, who is a barrister at the Law Office Cloisters in the UK, focusing on artificial intelligence, discrimination, and employment. We have Nicoletta Giannuzzo, who's a scientific officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center with a focus on digitalization in education. And Enrique Fernandez Macias, who's also scientific officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center with a focus on emerging technologies and employment. We'll be using the tool Slido, and I think if you can go to the next slide, is there a slide for the etiquette and the code? Yeah, exactly. So we'll be using the tool Slido for interaction between the audience and panelists. You can scan this QR code with our mobile phone or with your mobile phone, or connect to slido.com and tap the code standards for AI. Then you have to enter the education and employment room. For Zoom, we please ask you to turn your cameras and audios off if you're not hosting, and use the chat, or if you're not a presenter, and use the chat only for technical questions to the host. And we move to 10-minute individual presentations now for each panelist, maximum 10 minutes, so 5 to 10 minutes would be good. After which we will all reflect together on further steps and standardization efforts needed in education and employment. So without further ado, I would like to leave the floor now to Dee Masters.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's Dee Masters. I'm a barrister at Cloisters, and I specialise in employment and discrimination law with a particular interest in AI. If I could just go to the next slide, please. And the next one. Thank you very much. So for me, there are really 4 challenges that I'd like to emphasise in the context of the employment relationship. The first issue is transparency. And in particular, I have a real concern that employees and workers are having huge amounts of data collected about them, processed about them, and then significant decisions being made about them with very little understanding of precisely what's going on. And I think a really useful way of illustrating that is in the context of recruitment, and in particular AI-powered interviews, where we know that sometimes millions of data points are being gathered and analysed, and yet nobody seems to have any sensible understanding of precisely how that data is being used and how a decision is being made as to who should be recruited, who should be shortlisted, etc., etc. And then the second point is really about observability. So actually, how can employees and workers know when AI tools are being used, whether or not discrimination is happening? And I want to be really clear about how I'm using the word discrimination, because I know that in the AI ethics space in particular, it's very common to talk about bias, but I think there needs to be a really firm focus on the principle of non-discrimination as understood in European law, which has a very specific meaning that is different to bias and different to fairness, which I think is often confused with the principle of non-discrimination. And then a fourth issue for me, which I don't think is talked about enough, is how to accommodate disabled people. We know that the way that AI works, and in particular machine learning, is to look for correlations and patterns. That might be okay if you fit within data norms, but if you look different, if you sound different, if you present differently, if you have a different working pattern because you're disabled, I think there's a real question mark as to whether AI tools can accommodate that and whether reasonable accommodations can be made for disabled people. And then lastly, I think there's a real challenge around accuracy. If we're going to be using AI tools to make important decisions about employees and workers, what does accurate look like? For example, if we think about facial recognition technology, which is sometimes being used in the workplace, how accurate does it need to be in order to be acceptable? And I think answering that will be really important. Can I go on to the next slide, please? So what do I see as the way forward? I mean, I don't have a technical background, I'm a lawyer, but if there were 4 solutions that I would like to see the technical community develop, they would be this. First of all, I think when employers are using AI tools in high risk contexts, so who to employ, who to dismiss, for example, I think they should only be able to use those tools where a personalized explanation can be provided. So what data has been looked at, how that data has been weighed, how a particular conclusion has been reached. And I think that would also go some way, not just the transparency issue, but also the observability issue I talked about. So trying to understand whether or not there's discrimination. Secondly, I think there needs to be some means of understanding how AI tools treat disabled people. So some means of understanding, is this data set sufficiently representative of the vast different ways in which disability can manifest itself, and can reasonable accommodations be made for disabled people? I believe passionately in data reciprocity. I don't think it's good enough that employers can gather huge amounts of data that employees are then essentially out in the cold on. Employees and workers need to be able to look at big data so that they can understand whether tools are being used appropriately, accurately, in a non-discriminatory way. And then finally, I'd like to see accepted universal standards as to accuracy. So going back to my example of facial recognition, how often does that technology have to be right for us to say that it's accurate? So those for me are the real challenges that I'd like to see the technical community take on and perhaps find solutions to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dee, for your slides. We'll move directly without delay to Enrique Fernandez, Macias.
Thank you. So can you go to the next one? Yeah. Thanks a lot. So, well, I will speak a little bit about algorithmic management, which is a topic that I've been researching recently, and where I think the kinds of discussions of this conference are very important about standardization and regulation, because this is something which is very new. By algorithmic management, what I refer to, this is something that compared to what Dee was speaking about before, she was more about the hiring process. What I refer to is mostly about the use of algorithms in general for managing labor within organizations. So this can be to assign tasks, to assign positions, et cetera, to kind of coordinate the work within organizations. This is something that is, let's say, endemic in digital labor platforms. This is what digital labor platforms such as Uber, et cetera, do. This is what their key kind of business practice in many ways. But this is something that is slowly also being extended into regular work. The pandemic, in that sense, has taken a big leap in that respect. And then it is very important to understand this topic, the potential implications, and then eventually to be able to regulate it. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think when these methods of algorithmic management are used in work context for work organization, specifically if they are using very complex systems for actually defining those algorithms such as AI or AI driven, then there are a number of issues that emerge in terms of work organization and potentially troubling implications. There are issues about data ownership and privacy that Dee was referring to before in the context of hiring, but this also applies to internal work practices. There are issues also about autonomy at work, or a feeling of lack of autonomy that workers subject to these kind of practices often refer to. Also issues about transparency in decision making. And then there is a generalized feeling that the increasing use of algorithmic management within workplaces tend to generate power imbalances. Let's say that some of the equilibria that have been reached in terms of the governance of labor within organizations over many years, over decades or centuries, is kind of being challenged somehow by these new practices that change some of the modes of organizing work and some of the ways in which, for instance, workers through, let's say, collective bargaining systems or industrial relations systems, etc., could contest some decisions by management, for instance. And in that respect, the key problems, I think, are issues of opacity and complexity when we refer to algorithmic management of work. There is, in general, with the use of these tools, a generalized level of opacity, which tends to be legitimized by intellectual property systems and also by business practices, that makes it very hard to actually contest decisions that are made algorithmically. And also, there is a very strong problem of complexity, which means that workers and, in general, people in work organizations, they often fail to understand exactly how decisions are being made, and they lack the tools, the skills, the competences to be able to understand them. And this adds to the problem of opacity. This makes it particularly difficult to contest or somehow negotiate, etc., these kind of practices. There are no clear solutions for this yet. This is a very much an emerging issue. There are different approaches that are being discussed, but they are more discussed than implemented so far. There are, for instance, ideas about external auditing. This is something that in general is being applied to platforms in general, and in this way it's also discussed in the context of platforms for coordinating labor within organizations. The idea that there can be some kind of external body that would implement some types of audits to ensure that the algorithms are unbiased or do not produce some of these negative potential outcomes. There are also ideas about trying to control these or manage these through social dialogue. A very interesting case, for instance, is the case of Germany, where there is this very long tradition of co-determination of employment, of decisions within organizations, where works councils have a say normally in those decisions. And then there is a discussion ongoing right now in Germany to what an extent works council also should have a say on algorithms used at work. And then other issues such as mandatory transparency or regulated decision making. Next slide, please. So what is missing in the current regulatory and standardization landscape of algorithmic management for work? I would say nearly everything. And I'm not particularly expert in issues of standardization as such, but my feeling is that this is partly because it's so new. There is no common terminology, and this clearly makes the whole thing kind of confusing. There is a lot being discussed about this, but people refer to different terminology and different concepts. So there is a need of standardization in that respect. There is also clearly more research needed to identify the implications of these new forms of work, to also be able to identify key parameters that then will have to be measured with some established metrics in order to try to identify potentially traveling effects or whatever that needs to be standardized or regulated. And again, there is hardly any specific regulation so far. What way forward? My feeling in this respect is that new problems may require new solutions. As I was saying before, in general with platforms, there is what I see is that the type of approach for regulation and standardization tends to follow similar approaches to things such as the regulation of finance or banks, etc., with the idea of external audits. Now, my feeling, being not an expert again in standardization and auditing, etc., is that the issues of opacity and complexity that I was mentioning before makes it very difficult for this kind of approach of some kind of centralized auditing to work. And my feeling is that perhaps it would work better if we tried to look at alternative modes of regulations and control, things such as, for instance, the open source model, which is kind of originates also from software development and algorithms in a way. And this implies a decentralized mode of control based on high transparency and open collaboration. Also, there has been discussions, and this is something that we discussed briefly in a recent paper that we wrote here in the JRC on these topics, about the possibility of creating mandatory, in a way, external data trusts, which can be accessed by workers' representatives and employers' representatives, and that can be the basis of negotiations for these kind of algorithms, in a way that you still allow and still respect intellectual property and business practices, but introducing some degree of control. So these are just possible ideas for discussion, and I'm very interested to see what people say also about standardization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I saw that there's also already a first question on Slido. I'll be taking the questions after every presenter has also had the chance to present their slides. But let me have this one comment in between. Is I find it interesting that Dee and Enrique both talking about employment, but both talking about different applications in employment. One specifically where Dee talked about AI-driven or data-driven recruitment, and Enrique about algorithmic management. But Dee also talking about more general data-driven applications. That one thing is that they found similar issues with transparency, or the other way around, no access to data and opacity and complexity, and they had similar proposals on what should be like a good way to solve or to address these issues. One, Dee spoke of data reciprocity, and Enrique about, for example, external data trusts or the open source model, or generally just making the data and the understanding of these tools more transparent and more understandable from both sides, the employer's side and the employee's side. I think that is already very interesting to see. And now I'm also very excited to hear about what Nicoletta Giannuzzo has to say about more education-specific applications. Nicoletta, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. So as Songul just mentioned, that we're moving now to the education domain. My background is on research, design, and evaluation of digital learning environments. Interestingly, I started with intelligent tutoring systems back in the 90s. The key concept remains a little bit. Things are changing a lot. And then I've moved and I've worked with different kinds of technologies. Now in JRC, I'm the project manager of Selfie. This is a meta tool, let's say, that we have designed it for schools to think about how they are using technologies in order to support strategic decision making in order to develop their digital capacity. So how is this relevant? This tool consists of questionnaires for 5 education levels, and it's available in 39 languages. Up till now, we have 3.3 million users. This is like a huge data set, like collecting data from school leaders, teachers, and students from 88 countries. The participation in the tool is anonymous, and the data we're using are user-generated. They're not machine-generated. But this kind of data, they have allowed us to gain some insights about the issues that they might emerge when education data are collected. So if we go on the next slide, I can elaborate a little bit more. First issue we're seeing, and I think it's across different domains, is that there are different perceptions of the terms related to digital education. You can have the same term, and it's not only differentiated between individuals, but it's also between different categories of users. Like teachers might be understanding the use of technology in one way, students in a different way. So in this case, what we are seeing as a solution we're promoting is like this human intervention and discussion in order to create this consensus around the use of technologies and understanding. The other thing is, like, you might be having the same tool, the same technology, but you have many different implementations, and you see people referring to it in many different ways, and you have like a wide range and span of references around the same thing. So here, what we use as a case to support like understanding is like we're providing different examples and trying to situate and create like a more fine-grained description. I mentioned before that our tool is available in 39 languages, which is giving us the opportunity to see what happens when it comes to the terminology across different like countries. And what we have seen is that there is no one-to-one correspondence between terminologies. You have one term and you cannot always translate it with a similar set of words in a different language because they might not exist at all. And recently, when with the school closures, we had a huge discussion about how to describe what was happening. Was it remote teaching and learning? Was it emergency remote teaching learning? Was it blended learning? It started as remote, it continued as blended. Some language did not have this concept of blended. So there's a lot of ambiguity around the terminology used. The second thing is, I mean, I'm calling it, and I'm pulling it in quotation marks, it's fluidity. Because of the rapid developments in digital technologies, you see new terms emerging, and there is time needed in order to create consensus about the terminology and for people to start understanding what is meant. Sometimes a term might be very superficially used. So here, it's something that we have observed that it needs, it has to be taken into account. The other thing is anonymity. Anonymity is connected to openness. Recently, with all this misinformation, we showed like how anonymity has been connected to lack of accountability on the one hand. In our case, anonymity is crucial because in order for people to be able to express freely, it's important that they don't have the worry that they might be penalized for what they are saying. And I have to say that it's similar with employment, especially in education. There are power relationships we need to consider between the school leaders and the teachers, and between the teachers and the students. What we're doing also as a practice is that the schools receive back a report with their aggregated data, so they cannot identify the answers. But again, this is something that we feel always that the school needs to be ensured. And analysis of our data, I mean, we have seen different practices. For example, students receive a URL in order to log into the tool and complete like their answers. So in many cases, they might send the URL to other friends. They might click and choose and write silly things. But from our analysis, it doesn't seem to be an extended practice or a practice that sort of creates a big noise for our data. So in our case, anonymity is a key, and we feel it's important that we preserve it, and it's critical, depending, of course, on the context. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we are seeing this tool, which I describe it as a meta tool for schools to think about how they're using technologies, including AI, in their practice, also as a regulation instrument. And I want to unpack this a little bit more by saying that currently there is emphasis on standards for the human and standards for the machine, like what the human should be doing, what the machine should be doing in a way. However, this symbiotic relationship between the two needs also to be regulated. And we're seeing that there is something that we're calling like mid-level management emerging because of the raised needs around technology, so that schools, for example, they start to having more responsibilities and more autonomy to regulate and make decisions about digital technologies. But it's not only schools, and that's why I've pointed out that we need to identify who are the key actors and what could be their role there. So we are seeing as well like NGOs, universities, playing a role there in advising schools, facilitating training, technology maintenance. There's this expert group on ethical guidelines on artificial intelligence and data in teaching and learning. And they also have identified the crucial role of the school, where they recommend, for example, that schools should be having pilots before implementing an AI system. They should be evaluating an AI system. And at the same time, they should put in place policies and procedures to handle emerging issues when these technologies are used. So I think this maps a little bit to what Enrique mentioned as a decentralized model, giving the role not so much to somebody who is making the decisions top down and should be implemented by all, because also there are many variations which cannot be captured beforehand. So this is, from my side, what I would like to put on the table to start the discussion. Thank you.
I always forget to unmute, sorry. Thank you very much, Nicoletta, and all of the speakers. You have already given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of basis for our ongoing discussions. But before we move to the mural canvas along which we will be structuring our discussion, there are some questions from the audience on Slido. And I would like to go along popularity, but not just, because it seems the first questions started with Enrique. Of course, he was the second speaker, and Dee was the first speaker. So people needed also some time to actually warm up to the tool. So I think there he had some advantages. But one question to Enrique would be that. The question comes from Anonymous, and the person says, I agree with you about transparency in algorithmic management. What type of data processes should be made transparent to employees and workers?
Well, this is yet something to be discussed, and that's the whole point of the discussion today. I mean, I would say that a general principle is things that concern you and affect you in terms of decision making, within the workplace, and this is similar to what Dee was referring to in the hiring process. Any data that is used in a way that generates a decision that affects you directly, my feeling is that could be used as a principle for identifying which data you have a right to access, and also the actual algorithms or the principles behind the decision making that affect you. It seems to me that it's reasonable to argue that they should be accessible to the person. Now, an issue that you always have within workplaces is that many of these rights and many of these issues, they have to be recognized that they have a collective component. So it's not only an individual one. And this is a key basis of labor law. And Dee knows much more than I do about that for a very long time, that, you have to recognize also collective rights in the context of work relations. And I would say that this should apply also to that kind of data. So it's not only your individual data and your ability to contest individually, but it should also imply some collective access and then some collective right to challenge. This would be my answer.
Dee, would you like to add on that, as it also touches upon your expertise?
I completely agree. And one of the other questions that's asked in the Lido I've just seen is about whether I think that the law as it currently stands protects workers and employees against discrimination. And I think the answer to that is that at the moment, we've got a pretty good legal structure, but what we don't really have are the tools that allow us to leverage it. And one of the points that Enrique picks up on about kind of collective access to data and ability collectively to analyze it, these are all sort of softer tools, if you like, that we need in order to have a really effective principle of non-discrimination that we can really enforce when it comes to AI tools. So absolutely, completely agree with you, Enrique.
Thank you. I'm not sure if maybe let's start. Maybe let's open that can of worms. No, first there's a question to Nicoletta. I prefer that. So regarding anonymity, does your it comes actually from Dee. Dee, if you would like to ask it yourself.
Yes, so I was really interested in what you were saying about anonymity, and I agree with you that it's this double-edged sword. And I think there's a real debate at the moment as to whether anonymity can also be a disservice, because sometimes we're not collecting data about protected characteristics, so someone's race or sex, because we have this sense that it's wrong to collect that sort of data. But it equally seems to me that without collecting that data, how can we understand whether or not AI tools are discriminatory? And so I was just interested with your work and your project, whether you collect data about protected characteristics.
We actually do. And the thing is, there's a quite interesting story regarding, let's say, gender. And because there was some discussion about what to include there. There are different reactions from different countries as well, because this is an EU tool. And we have provided it as an open question. So we do collect, like, for our analysis, but this is analysis that is done only within JRC, and the schools do not receive this kind of data, but we do.
Before we move to the mural, I would like to ask one more provocative question or provocative comment that is actually to all the panelists, and it says, Anonymous says, there's actually no evidence that AI can predict any social outcomes, for example, in the employment or education performance. So why they cannot predict it at all? I mean, this is also a controversial statement, but the point is, why don't we just ban these users of these tools? Is there any benefit that we could actually gain from these tools, or should we just ban them completely because they only harm us? It's a bit of a
I can jump in there.
difficult question.
I think we need to have a really urgent debate about red lines. That we can't assume that just because an AI tool is useful, it's lawful or ethical or appropriate. And I am sure that there are some uses of AI that we just shouldn't go there, and it just shouldn't be permitted because, for example, it doesn't do what it says it does, or even if it can do what it says it does it in a way that's discriminatory or infringes on human rights. So I completely agree with the principle that there are just some tools that should not be permitted and they should just be prohibited. But I'm interested to hear what anyone else thinks.
I can also offer, like, the education point, Enrique, unless you. So, I mean, I'm in the same line with Dee here. And especially when it comes to education, I really like this recommendation from the expert group on doing pilots and evaluation of this kind of systems to see, like, where they actually contribute. There's an argument there, for example, that when you have an AI system in your school, you might support the teacher to, say you have a teacher with a class with 30 students, you don't have the time to support them equally, so you have a system which collects some data and supports you to provide more personalized learning. This is the argument. I think in every case it should be tested, and that's why we have these proposals made on the one hand. There are other cases where AI systems, imagine, for example, school MOOCs, they're huge courses, and there, if you have an AI system making some recommendation, facilitating discussion, supporting with the supporting with the correction of the assignments, this creates some opportunities. But the question there is, like, I agree, like, we need to evaluate, do we need it, under what circumstances, and how we use it. I wouldn't go to a yes or no response. I'm saying yes under circumstances, and having very clear what it contributes, and if it does, what it says. Another issue I would like to identify there is, with this kind of systems, we try to model the human behavior, and when we're in the field of education, it's so complex, and there are so many interactions that you cannot actually predict beforehand. And even the teaching process is and learning process is so fluid and changing from moment to moment. So where you are imposing a model, it has to be very clear that it encapsulates a pedagogical style. And what you integrate in the algorithm is not what can be done, and sometimes it's not what is important. So I totally agree that we always need to have a critical stance in this case, and be very clear about what problems it solves, if it actually solves them, and under what circumstances we should be using them.
Maybe just a couple of additional points to this issue. What I would say, I mean, in general, I agree. Of course, we have to evaluate the different uses that are made of this or any tool. And if there is if we collectively think that there are some uses of a given tool that is bad or negative or damaging, of course, we are entitled as a society to say we don't allow that to happen. We do that all the time with all types of tools that we have devised. Now, that is not to say that these tools are not useful. And what I would say, and even in the kinds of things that I study, it is very clear that the use even of these tools of algorithmic management, of using AI tools for coordinating extremely complex processes of work, of joint work, of collaborative work, for instance. And I was mentioning this example of open source. Open source software development is something that has been going on for decades now, which has achieved incredible things, technically, and to a large extent, they were built upon this kind of platformized systems of work organization. It's just that they were decentralized and transparent. So what I would say is that the tools, the technologies, AI, algorithms, etc., they are very powerful and they can have amazing uses. It's just that what we should do is this kind of discussion that we are having and try to identify things that should be done and things that maybe shouldn't.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, although I'm the neutral moderator here, but I also see the point that AI tools are not just. Enrique, we cannot hear you anymore. You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I finished.
Sorry, because the video is lacking. The video is lacking. Okay, good to know. I mean, many of these data-driven tools, of course, they are bad uses of AI, and we need to talk about red lines, as Dee already said, and also we need to talk about a privacy-related issue that Nicoletta also mentions when we collect data, but also. What Enrique said, that there are some benefits in the tools that we use, and they are not just used to predict these social outcomes or the education and employment performance. And we should make sure that we draw these red lines where they are needed to prevent that these harms, that these tools actually pose any harm, but also consider about. We need to talk about, we should also exploit the benefits that we can actually get from these tools that are not necessarily related to predicting social outcomes, but can also help us in managing and pattern recognition and not repeating the same mistakes maybe over and over, like something like nudging tools or so on. I would like to move from the question and answers now to the mural, and structure the rest of the discussion around this one. So based on the, can we have a view of the mural? Thank you. So the rest of this talk is structured into three exercises that we are going to do. One is brainstorming, the second is mapping along a canvas, and the final one is going to prioritize the challenges that we are talking about. And based on your presentations that you already gave, and also based on the discussion that we now had, we have already pre-prepared some of the points that you have made in the brainstorming. So if we can first go to the brainstorming and give the speakers also some time to take this in. And I don't want to like impose or put any words in your mouth or say that these are specifically the things that you said. So if there's something that you do not agree with or that you think is not precise enough in terms of a sticky note, please raise your hand. But I would like to go speaker by speaker to comment a bit on the sticky notes that we collected and the issues that we collected, and maybe ask them if they want to elaborate on one specific point or one more again to guide us in the further discussions. Dee, would you like to start?
Thanks. I've just been looking at my green stickies, which absolutely encapsulate everything that I was trying to get across. And I think for me, the themes that you actually see across all the stickies are the themes of sort of transparency, observability, so understanding whether or not there's discrimination or other improper matters going on. And then I suppose the third theme is the red lines, and actually at what point do we say enough is enough and this isn't acceptable. So good job. I'd be interested to see how it translates across.
Thank you. Nicoletta, would you like to?
Yes, I'm
Thanks.
the blue, correct?
Matteo is collecting based on your comments more sticky notes. That's very helpful. Thank you. Nicoletta, would you like to also add
Yes,
some comments?
I'm the blue, correct? Yes,
Exactly.
it's,
Yeah.
it's a blue.
This was just also for me to know from whom the comments each came from, but
Yes,
and
yes.
I know there are like some overlapping issues.
Yes, and thank you. I mean, it's as Dee was saying, thanks a lot because it captures all the key points. What I would like basically to comment is these issues emerging from data related to education. They demonstrate how complex the phenomenon is and how an algorithm might capture sides of it. So our trust on it and the way we integrate it in our practice, it has to have taken into account that the only sides of the whole activity is are captured. And sometimes that was a point that came up when we were discussing earlier, that sometimes we're focusing very much on what technology can do, thinking that this is everything about education. Like, for example, if technology can handle content, if technology can model this kind of activity, so everything focuses on this. And this, in terms of research, is quite dangerous in a way, because we're putting a lot of weight on things that can be modeled, but we are forgetting those that they cannot and might be equally interested. So here education, I think, differentiates a little bit from employment, because digital is only part of education, and we need to have a broader perspective. So when we're speaking about AI, it's important to know what it can do, but also to place equal emphasis on what it cannot do and how we can support it in the practice, if this makes sense. So thank you.
Yeah, Matteo's been trying to capture this. So for one, I've been trying to capture the complexity, the context dependency of AI tools and how they work with the sticky note context dependency. And I liked your example of translations. Sorry. I like the example that you gave with translations, that the entire data that actually is being collected could have a completely different meaning just if you put it into a different cultural context and linguistic context. So these terms are quite, the tools, not just the terms, but also the tools are quite fluid across different domains and different cultures. And the second point, Matteo has captured your point about some processes that are not observable, that are more latent, with the sticky note on observability of the model versus limitations and importance. So I understood it in a way that some things are happening in the educational process that cannot be datafied that well. And if we focus then on guiding or directing this educational process with only what we can observe and what we can identify, we might lose some important aspects, more of this tacit knowledge that on the way.
Exactly, and if I can add on this relates to how we situate AI in the practice of education. Like, what role do we give it? Like, and here it's the importance of the role of the teacher, the role of the student, and I would like also to connect to the lack of autonomy mentioned by Enrique. In many cases, I see as one of the issues which might be connected to machine-driven personalized learning, that students should be able to develop this skill of monitoring, reflecting on their learning. And if this is structured from the machine and done from the machine, then you take away the student autonomy. That's one thing. And the overstructuring that the algorithms can give to this learning and teaching process might also result to the lack of autonomy for teachers as well. So there are cross-cutting points from the side of employment and education, I think. And I think another issue which is also important there is, and it's captured as well, is the power relationships between teachers and students and school leaders, and the data collected from students who are underage, and how do they make a decision about their data, and who is making decision about the data they generate. So that's a key issue, I think, to be taken into account.
Yeah, I like this. I also like this, what you said about being very specific about the role that the tools have to take. Matteo captured this with a comment on agency. I think, yes, we need to make sure that there are clear boundaries on what tasks the AI tool is supposed to perform, and that we don't end up over-relying and overusing and over-trusting these types of tools, and start restructuring well-working dynamics just around the tool, just so that it can somehow fit in, and then let the tool take over, and how we decide what we want to structure education. And to prevent that from happening, we need clear boundaries. Enrique, would you like to add?
Sure. Well, I would say this reflects very well my points. So it's all fine from my side. The pink parts are good. Then I was trying to think. I mean, looking at this big picture with lots of things all around, I was trying to think if how to structure this. If you think about standardization, I mean, what are these essentially about? And what I was kind of thinking is that all these in the end revolves around data. And I think that the key issues are always, it's on the one hand, the collection of the data, on the other hand, the storage and slash ownership of the data, which are obviously related. And then three, it would be the processing of the data. So these are the three kind of key issues that require, and I'm always thinking more about the topic that I know, sorry about that, but my feeling is that it applies probably in a similar way, because it's a more abstract way to think about this. So these would be the kind of key steps where standardization would be required. And then I would say that the two principles that are kind of all around here are, on the one hand, the issue of transparency one way or another, in the sense that all these processes, what data is collected, what is storage, how it is processed, all these needs to be transparent in one way or another. And then I think that in particular, at least for work, and I'm not sure whether it applies to other cases, it may apply as well, there is a second important principle, which is a principle that you should somehow give also some agency to the people affected by these algorithms with respect to them. And this is this whole, I was mentioning before, this idea, this issue about the co-determination system in Germany. The interesting thing there is that this raises this, I think, important issue that workers that are affected by these algorithms, they should have some say. They should have at least the ability to negotiate them, to say how they would prefer them, and then to be able to negotiate with managers. And perhaps the broader issue is this idea that you should also give agency, let's say, to the subjects of these algorithms, so that they are not pure I don't know, passive subjects, but they are actually active.
Yeah, I like that. I also see, like, from both the education and employment side, I see two issues or challenges that you have, that all of the speakers have mentioned over and over. One is with the complexity and the transparency issues, and then so there's data being collected, and we want to have transparency on what type of data is being collected, what is being done with it, and how is this used to affect our lives? If by us, I mean like students, workers, but also employers, employees. And that also links very nicely with the panel I was in yesterday about the documentation of data and documentation standards on data collection, data cleaning, data processing, and data application. And that we need to have good standardized documentation practices along the way to actually ensure or enforce more transparency in these new tools emerging in the market. And the second issue that is being mentioned by all the speakers is the one about power imbalances that are being created. The call for giving agency also to the people that are being affected by the algorithms, and then different solutions being provided by our speakers. One was, for example, Dee mentioned the point on data reciprocity. Enrique had this idea about trusts, data trusts, and the social dialogue and the open source model, which are all very interesting avenues that it could be actually taken when it comes to making sure that these power imbalances are not affected. But I would like to add into this discussion one comment that has been made by Anonymous, and it's the top question on Slido, because I like the provocative point about this. So that what is it that makes these power imbalances, what is it about AI that actually changes these power imbalances? And the question specifically is, are power imbalances in the workplace created by decision automation or the lack of power of employees to contest them? This also holds for human decision makers. So why are power imbalances affected now that we are talking about AI in education and employment? Although we had these power imbalances and these issues before. Who would like to?
I'll jump in. If you think about the employment relationship, forget about AI for a second. The reason there's a power imbalance is that the employer has the combination of authority and capital, and the employee has only the labor to sell. So that power imbalance has always been there. And the difficulty with AI is it adds a new type of power imbalance, because you then have the employer having access to these huge amounts of data that are being used to make significant decisions, and yet the employee is also excluded from that. So I think the power balance has always been there. I think this augments it significantly. And that's why we have to have a really meaningful debate about what we can do, what tools we can put in place to try and redress that balance to make it fair and proper.
Thank you. If
Shall
no
I add a
one
little bit on the
wants
education
to
perspective
add,
here?
yes, if you like.
Yeah, it's along what Dee just mentioned. It's a new layer when it comes to students. All this kind of data collected about them, they create an understanding about them, which is might be adapted from their teachers, shaping their behavior. And if this algorithm does not capture, if we think that the algorithm captures everything about the student, that we know everything about the student, we behave according to the algorithm, then we're shaping a future for the student, which is not based on accurate data in a way. That's one thing. Second thing is the ownership of data and how this kind of data follow and determine the life of their students, in like as they grow and they make their choices, how they are free after a while to make choices or change their behavior, their way. I mean, let's say I'm a student, I'm a bad student in one school, and then if my data follow me in another school, they take away from me the opportunity to do a restart, a reset, because people they create like some preconditions and preconception about me, and we know how very much this prophecy like works with the student, like the teacher. Like if a student if a teacher believes that the student behaves in a specific way, then the student eventually will start, because there's this, it's dynamic. So there, there is the power imbalance, but it's amplified because there is more information collected, which out of the hand of one of the two participants in this relationship.
Maybe just
Thank you.
a small.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Sure.
Maybe just
Go ahead,
a
please.
small point to add. There is a bit of a lag, so I can see that. Just a small point. Many of these things that we are talking about in the case of AI systems are things that are kind of commonly applied, on the basis of almost kind of common sense and basic ethical relations between people in workplaces already. So for instance, when we talk about the explainability of decisions that affect you, this is something that in workplaces, this is implicitly and in many ways explicitly assumed that decisions that management makes that affect you, you do have the right to ask on what basis that decision, for instance, when we're talking about hiring, etc., and you have the right to contest if you think that they are unfair, etc., and in many ways that's why the whole thing about opacity is so important, because sometimes it can be opaque almost to the organization itself, especially when you're implementing these through kind of self-governing systems through AI, I don't know, machine learning, whatever. You always should have the right to know why a particular decision that affects you has been taken, no matter whether it has been done by a human or by a system.
Thank you very much. I like that. Quite often it comes down to what is new about AI. Well, it's the transparency issue, it's the opacity issue, that it adds a layer of understanding about the employer-worker relationship, and also about the teacher-student relationship that is not fully understood on both sides. And this gives away control to an additional agent in the relationship. And if this is not understood very well, which is the unique issue about artificial intelligence, this does affect the balances that are existing in the first place. So the uniqueness about the challenge of artificial intelligence very much seems is the transparency issue, the opacity issue. And I like that we have talked about specific issues or incidents that have occurred in the employment and education sector and that we have tried now in our brainstorming to specify these points in sticky notes. And now I would like to see if we are able to map all the challenges that we mentioned, maybe not all of them because we won't have the time, into a matrix that we have taken from like the standardization literature, to make sure where we actually want to apply the standards that we want to apply and which directions we should go. So bear with me, I will explain the matrix now a little bit to you. So now we are going to do a mapping exercise. Yes?
Yes, so just to tell you that as we speak, someone asked a question on Slido, which we may keep in mind during the mapping exercise. So an anonymous question: we don't have an agreed upon definition of transparency. What do you believe the most important relevant elements of transparency are? And I think as we are here in the standard setting exercises, perhaps it's useful to keep in mind about operationalizing concepts like this, since it's one of the core concepts we've been talking about so far.
Exactly, yeah. And I think we can use that very well also in our mapping exercise, because if you look at the horizontal axis in this matrix, so this matrix maps standardization needs for now data for AI, education and employment, by considering on the x-axis what aspect we actually need to standardize first. So are we talking about a terminology issue? So what terms do we use to specify the challenge or the problem that we want to address? So we are talking about wording, definitions, and taxonomy. And Matteo, what you also have mentioned about the question on transparency, before we actually want to standardize transparency and measure transparency and give like indicators for transparency, we need to first be clear about our terminology around that, and also about the measurements that we want to use to define what transparency is, which takes us to the second category on the x-axis, which is metrology. So it's about measures, metrics, specific quantifiable ways to assess the challenges and the concepts that we want to standardize. The third one is, and these categories are highly also overlapping. So how do we measure the performance? So how do we measure that this is like a good transparent, this is good transparency level and this is bad transparency level, or this is good AI and this is bad AI because it has done all the risk management, all the technical robustness, all the discrimination assessment. I want to use discrimination and not bias mitigation measures because of what Dee said in her presentation. Not just, but also focus on the accuracy dimension, but also look at other dimensions on how to measure the performance of these tools that we use. And compatibility or the interface is also about the interoperability of these tools. So how well do they work on different sides, but also not just the data that is being used, or data that being collected and how interoperable it is, but also one issue that I know comes from algorithmic management in the on online labor market platforms, or not just online labor market platforms, is that feedback collected on one platform cannot easily be translated to another platform. Enrique, you have mentioned that once in a workshop at some point. And finally, the regularity assessment. So how well does the standard actually fit the regulation that we have? So for example, in the Artificial Intelligence Act, the proposal to regulate artificial intelligence from the European Commission, there are some obligations for high-risk AI applications, but they are quite abstract and high level. So they talk about transparency, they talk about data governance, they also talk about technical robustness, but and do the standards that we define in these other categories actually fit the requirements that are mentioned in the regulation? And I've taken the liberty again to pre-prepare this because we're also running a little bit out of time. So I would like to dedicate like 2 minutes maybe to go through every speaker. I mean, 2 minutes for everyone to go through every speaker to discuss the mapping and where you see the challenge fits this matrix. And then we move on to the prioritization exercise finally. I think, Dee, would you like to start? And sorry, one thing that I forgot to mention is the y-axis mentions the maturity of the AI application. So are we talking about data? Are we talking about models where the data is fed into? Or are we talking about real market applications?
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on the transparency theme because it's a question that's been most recently asked in the Slido, as explained earlier, but also because I think there's another interesting question in the Slido, which is, doesn't the GDPR guarantee transparency? And what I'd like to say about that is that it comes back to my point right at the beginning, which is transparency isn't just about knowing what data is being used. Transparency, I think, has to be about a personalized explanation for what's going on when an AI tool is used. So if you look at the GDPR, yes, you can access your personal data. Sometimes you have a right to the meaningful logic around an AI tool, but what that meaningful logic means in practice tends to be very high level and completely meaningless. What we need is a requirement, a standard, that when a decision is made about me, for example, whether or not I should be offered a job or whether or not I should be shortlisted, I should know why, for me, that decision has been reached. In the same way that if a human being was making a decision about me, I could say, why did you reject me for this job? And if I didn't like it, I could take them to court and I could cross-examine them about it. We need the equivalent process when it comes to AI. So that's my, hopefully less than 2 minutes.
Yes.
Do you think that the transparency,
Yeah, sorry. So would it be fair to say that you're worried also about the scope for malicious compliance, so to speak? So yes, here's the algorithm. It's unintelligible. Here's the data. It's completely opaque. You've been granted transparency on the decisions that affect you. So that's what one of the aspects you're worried about.
Matty, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, we haven't really talked about it, but there's also another power imbalance, which is the understanding power imbalance. It can't be that you have to be terribly technical to understand how your data is being used. You can't say, I want my data, and you just get given 1,000 files that have got millions of pieces of data in if you don't know what they mean. And so that's why when we talk about transparency, I think we need to be clear about what we mean. I understand why we need to talk about terminology. For me, I would suggest that the key pinnacle to transparency is personalized explanations for how a tool is working. And that includes understanding what data is being used, how it's being judged and valued, and in a way that I can understand without having a technical background.
personalized explanations. I think we have that. Yeah, we have that sticky note. It's the green one, on the very right. Enrique, would you like to discuss one aspect for each?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that here probably my lack of expertise in the whole topic of standardization is where it kicks in better, because I find this a little bit difficult to come in. But what I would say, I mean, my feeling is that in the field that I was speaking about, I think that I would still emphasize that the two columns here are really what matters massively in the short term, which is the starting point, which is first the terminology. And, you know, this comment, very valid comment by someone saying, I mean, even when we're talking about transparency, which is a key issue in many ways that we keep on discussing, it's still not entirely clear what we mean. And so my feeling is that, you know, if you want to go as far as standardizing and measuring, etc., the very first thing is that you need to have very clear concepts that demarcate what you're talking about in a clear way. So this is my feeling in general with this area that I was talking about the use of algorithms for work organization. And then even this thing about measurement and metrology, as I was saying, my point would be we still need, once you have defined well the issues, then you still need to identify what are the key parameters that you should take into account for measuring. Which again is my feeling is that it's to a large extent is still to be identified. We know a little bit, but it's still largely to be done. So this is what I would say, and then you can probably go on with the rest of the standardization. But those are the basis. This what I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, this is also why I put transparency and complexity more at the beginning of the categorization. Nicoletta, one comment on this?
A very quick one. Basically, looking especially at measurement and performance characterization when it comes to education, I think there are two opposing forces. One is that we need these kind of things, but I would go back to what I was saying before. We need to be aware of a number of things that cannot be measured in numbers or cannot be described in a concrete way and solid way, but in a more fluid and changing way, and situate the role of AI in this complex situation.
So fluidity and dynamic. Thank you. So finally, prioritization. I would like to focus only on what's important. So we are trading off importance versus difficulty in the prioritization exercise. And I would like to ask each speaker to give me one challenge or one aspect that they consider is either difficult and important or easy and important to address. Dee.
Well, as you've got transparency there out first, I'm going to say it's difficult and important. I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure that's why we've talked about it so much.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you. Enrique.
I would go with the same one. Maybe one thing that I would ask is, you know, maybe we should think a little bit about why transparency is such a complicated issue. And my feeling is that we need to differentiate two things. There is one aspect of the difficulty of transparency, which is actually socially constructed, let's say, which is all the institutions around intellectual property, patents, etc., etc. That is, you know, being socially constructed is easier in a way, but more difficult in other ways. And then there is a proper technical aspect of the difficulty of transparency, which is in particular with AI-driven systems, in which the problem of transparency is that these systems tend to be a bit of a black box. So in my view, we need to differentiate those two things because they would require different approaches.
Yeah, so transparency of AI systems, but also transparency of the legal structures. Thank you. Nicoletta.
And I think it's connected in a way, but what from my side comes out is like the agency, the role the humans, the students, the teachers, they have, and how this can play and be related to transparency, to the power balance, to the power relationships. So I would put the agency as difficult and important as well, to understand it and define it and support it. because as Dee was saying, like transparency does not mean to bury somebody in like huge information who does not understand, but at the same time to be able to give them the opportunity to understand it, take informed decisions. For me, that's a more critical thing.
Thank you.
Some
Pity that
good
we
perhaps.
didn't find an easy one. Yes.
Yes, so maybe
Matteo?
to guide the exercise at this stage, because the risk is that everything is actually difficult. Maybe we should distinguish the difficulty purely on the technical axis of the AI rather than on the social, political, governance aspects of it. I don't know if that's the.
But then even the
of...
technical difficulty, yeah. Even the technical difficulty, I see issues. I mean, explainability, explainable AI is like a huge topic, and also in the technical conferences and the AI-related conferences. So even the
exactly,
because
but so there is
mostly because of the social complexity.
Yeah, but when we say difficulty here, implicitly we're meaning both technical and political difficulty. And which of these two dimensions we should consider
most difficult, the political one.
Yeah, that was mine. Yeah. But I suspect that the kind of answers that the exercise should provide are more technical ones.
I'm trying to find an easy one to put there so that it's not so pessimistic, this session. I would say maybe in easy and important, you can put something about terminology, as we were saying, or maybe it's not so important, but I do think that, thinking a little bit carefully about the terminology and try to differentiate concepts more clearly and avoid a little bit the messiness in all this area, or this is at least my feeling, that would be very useful as a starting point, and it's certainly not as difficult as these issues of technical transparency, etc., etc.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And that closes our session for today. We have to end it. Thank you. But also very important to end. And I like that we ended on a more positive note. But we are now closing it, our session on AI for education and employment. And I would like to thank all our excellent panelists and all of you for the participation. And we will now move to a coffee break until 10:45. So a coffee break a little bit shorter than expected. And I hope to see you later again in the following sessions on AI for media, for example, medicine and healthcare, and automation and robotics, or in the closing session after the lunch break in the main plenary room. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's super interesting and a bit painful to end so abruptly, but I guess it's just too complex of a topic to discuss in 1 hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ciao, thanks.
Bye.